What is up, YouTube, and welcome back to another Fridge Financials video. In today's video, we're talking about the consideration of Jerome Powell quitting, potentially amid all this beef we have between President Donald Trump and Jerome Powell. So we're going to break down the arguments here. We're going to talk about the articles and look at some different perspectives as to what Daddy Powell is going to be doing. So if you're excited for today's video, as always, feel free to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and as always, turn on the notifications for all future uploads. We have quite a few things to talk about here. Look at historical things, look at what's in the news headlines recently, and kind of go from there. So Bill Polt, who oversees Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, applauded chatter stating Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell would soon depart from his position. I'm encouraged by reports that Jerome Powell is considering resigning, he said in a Friday statement. I think this will be the right decision for America and the economy will boom. Okay. And let me tell you, if you ever listen to how Jerome Powell speaks about how the Fed is monitoring interest rates and inflation, stuff like that, he speaks with such confidence. He does not sound like he's going anywhere. So I read this article and I was like, okay, well, let's talk about it a little bit. Let's see what this guy's on here, and we'll kind of go from there. It is unclear whether specific reports the head of the Federal Housing Finance Agency is referring to. Okay, so we have no idea where he's getting it from. Powell's term is up in 2026 of May, and he indicated that he would not step down if President Trump asked him to do so. That's my boy, Jay Powell, right there. And this comes off as one of those things where it just becomes more and more. They're trying to pressure more and more. Jerome Powell, step down, step down. He's an idiot. He's this. Donald Trump tweets about him like once a week about how he's a fool for not cutting interest rates and for not doing this and for not doing that. This might just come off as just another one of those political, articles that's just trying to weed out Jerome Powell and try to just make him crack in some way, shape, or form. That's why I'm reading this right now, because we have no idea what the reports he's referring to is. So his words come a week after he urged Congress to launch an investigation into the Fed chair, accusing him of lying during his testimony before the Senate Banking Committee in late June. It also follows up months of tension between Powell and the Trump administration over interest rates, which has just been there like no tomorrow. It's basically like who has the bigger, like who has it. It's very, very, very bizarre as to in all the time of me following this, I've never seen such a combative, President Trump wants this, he wants this, and they're just kind of fighting over it to see what happens here. It's really interesting, but the president has long criticized Powell and urging him to resign over the decision to keep rates steady. I hope Congress really works this very dumb, hard-headed person over. We will be paying for his incompetence for many years to come. The board should activate. I just okay. Calling him a dumb, hard-headed person is just crazy, honestly. Like, you're in political power and you're just out here saying that is just absolutely wild. Powell has maintained that he is waiting to evaluate the impact of the president's sprawling tariff agenda before introducing lower rates. What we're waiting for to reduce rates is to understand what will happen with tariff inflation. There's a lot of uncertainty, and that's 100% true. You put these inflation data points in based off of tariffs and everything and how it's going to impact prices. Again, maybe it doesn't, okay? The thing is, though, is that we keep implementing more and more things. Now we had letters go out recently to a bunch of countries and jacking up rates there. I know there was an article came out about Canada raising tariffs over in Canada, which is going to jack up prices again as a result. And it's just a matter of just seeing not if, but when the data comes out, what is going to happen as a result. Is there going to be a huge uptick? Is there going to be a little bit of an uptick? Is there going to be no uptick? We don't really know. And that's kind of what Jerome Powell's major argument has been. And I understand it. And at the time of recording this video, this is the morning of CPI data. The CPI data, which is your consumer price index, is projected to come in higher compared to last month. Still lower than when Donald Trump was first put in office in January, I believe, but it's still going to start to have an uptick. And that kind of data point is going to just fuel the power for Jerome Powell to say, we need to wait on cutting interest rates. If CPI comes in lower than last month, somehow, and PPI does, and whatever other data points come in lower than for inflationary values, that might be more of a convincing argument. But if they come in higher, that's where the problem's going to be. Jerome Powell's going to be like, see, I told you, we don't know what's going to happen here. So Some has to pay tariffs, as we know, between the manufacturer, the exporter, the importer, the retailer. Somebody has to do it. That was based off of his FOMC meeting, I believe, like last month, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. Do not quote me on that. But I do remember him saying that somebody has to pay tariffs. Maybe it's just the manufacturer, maybe it's the exporter, maybe it's the importer, the retailer, the consumer. Like somebody has to pay it, no matter what. And that's kind of what he's talking about here. And they've had rumors of Scott Bessent, Chris Waller, and Kevin Hassett as being the replacements of him at this point here. The administration has also expanded the heaping criticism to include Powell's general leadership abilities in recent days. Earlier this week, the White House accused Powell of mismanaging the central bank budget, describing a planned renovation of its Washington headquarters as ostentatious. And that leads me to the next point. So it's like they're just trying to find every single thing against Jerome Powell to get him to quit. And they just keep digging up things. So Fed Powell asked for watchdog review of his project criticized by Trump officials. Okay, let's read into it. Why not? Fed Chair Jerome Powell has asked the U.S. Central Bank's Inspector General to review the costs involved in the renovation of its historic headquarters in Washington as Trump administration officials intensified their criticism of how the Fed is being run. I've asked the board's IG to take a fresh look at the project, Powell told Senate Banking Committee Chair Tim Scott and top Democrat Elizabeth Warren in a letter dated Monday and viewed by Reuters. The letter, first reported by Politico, responded to concerns raised by the Trump administration and Republican lawmakers about the renovation. The letter said that some features that had drawn criticism, including VIP elevators and dining rooms, had never been in the project scope, and others, including some new water features, ooh, fancy, has been eliminated. Changes to the original design were not substantial, and none of them added costs to the project, Powell wrote. Okay, I mean, it's just... I don't know. And again, it's supposed to... So, Russell Vaughn, who wrote that President Donald Trump was extremely troubled by cost overruns in the $2.5 billion project. Unbelievable. They're just looking for every single thing they can. And again, I'm talking about him should be resigning and stuff like that. And so this brings me up to the point of, why Jerome Powell is doing what he's doing. Jerome Powell is the Fed chair who is trying to keep the legitimacy of the Fed and the credibility of the federal government, of the Fed, the one who has the interest rates and stuff like that. The idea behind it is that he's trying to stay independent from all things. He wants the Fed to be independent. He wants to be independent from political pressures, Trump administration, everybody coming after him saying he should cut rates, he should do this, he should do that. And he's just sitting there saying, I do not care what you say. I'm going off of data points and looking at the information I am provided to make my decisions. He's making decisions based by data and not from political pressures like he's getting here from the Trump administration. This brings me up into researching, and believe it or not, you'll see a lot of similarities here, I feel like. The Great Inflation, which is what it's called, which is from the 60s, late 60s, all the way up till the 80s here, which we had this huge interest rate situation that happened here. And we have Ben Bernanke, who had wrote this book about what it is and what happened here, and where things happened and how things happened. And believe it or not, there's quite a little bit of overlap here. The story of the Great Inflation begins with deficit spending, which, as we know, we are now just used to it, I feel like, as a U.S. economy, where we always like to talk about deficit spending and spending the budgets and stuff like that. And, the big, beautiful bill was talking about that idea as well. And people were arguing about how it's actually going to reduce deficit spending. And, who knows, right? John F. Kennedy had run for president during a recession and promised to get America moving again. As a president, he proposed a big tax cut to boost the economy and lower unemployment, which stood at almost 7% when he entered office. Basically, since we're in a recessionary period, you got to boost the economy somehow, some way, shape, or form. Usually what happens and what the Fed has been doing recently when you go into a recession is when you get that recessionary period, they cut rates. Cutting rates allows you to borrow money cheaper. It allows you to be able to spend money because it boosts the economy because you're able to borrow money at a cheaper rate. You borrow it cheaper, you put it back in the economy, it boosts and stimulates the economy as a result. A big business can go out and get a loan for a lot cheaper. They get a loan for a lot cheaper. They can use that to then buy, hire more workers, increase their business, all those different kind of things there, which again, as a result, decreases unemployment and is going to hopefully boost the economy. That's usually what we talk about with interest rates here. But he did a huge tax cut, which again also can boost the economy because again, that's more money being put into the Americans' pockets, which means they can spend more of it, which can boost the economy. And and as more and more money is spent in the economy, businesses are getting bigger, they can hire more people, so on, so on, and so forth. After Kennedy was assassinated, Lyndon B. Johnson took over, followed through the tax cut, which helped bring unemployment down to 4% by 1965. That was the full level of unemployment that macroeconomists at the time believed was full employment, which Jerome Powell has talked about. Again, we always talk about the Fed has two ideas of having low inflation and maximum employment, and it's kind of having that balance between the two, what we always want to have. From a macroeconomic perspective, from macroeconomic policy perspective, it would have been a logical movement to ease up on the accelerator, but foreign policy and social goals took priority over economic stability. When President Johnson plunged America into a war in Vietnam in 1965, he opened up a firehouse of federal spending. Defense spending rose about 44% between 1965 and 1968. They would spend almost $850 billion on the war in today's dollars. And because the war was already unpopular, he was reluctant to support tax increases to pay for it. Which means if you don't hike up taxes to pay for this, what do? You crank up the money printer. You just start printing dollars and just printing dollars to fund this and fund it and fund it. Everybody has that meme now, Jerome Powell, who just cranks the money printer. That's basically what had to happen here as a result because it was so unpopular with the Americans. They definitely would have not been happy with a tax increase to fund a war that they already weren't happy with. So he was just I'm just going to print money myself and kind of just call it from there. Which, again, juices the economy because, again, there's more spending going on there. If you have a lot of money spent on defense, you need to hire more workers for defense to produce and to manufacture and to ship and all these kind of things there. So it boosts the economy, right? But you printed a lot of money as a result. At the same time, he launched his War on Poverty and the Great Society programs. This included the government and healthcare programs Medicare for elderly and Medicaid for low income, which began in 1965. Many Great Society programs would ultimately have important benefits, but they also had the effect of adding further to government spending. And we've talked about that with the Big Beautiful Bill and cutting back on that and all those different things there. All this deficit spending heated up an economy that was already running hot. Military contractors used government money to build guns, bombs, planes, and helicopters. Medical providers used government money on procedures, checkups, hospitals, so on and so forth. This increased demand for labor and materials already in short supply, pushing up prices of everything. So you're pushing out a lot of things here. You're making everybody do a lot of work and a lot of great things and expand and expand and expand, but there's already a limited supply of materials at the time. You have a lot of labor and a lot of demand and a lot of push, and not as much supply to keep up with it, which again pushes up your cost prices higher. This is where things start to see a little bit of overlap here. By the time President Nixon came into office, inflation was surging. Nixon continued the inflation fest with policies like an intensification of the Vietnam War, deficit spending, and as we shall see, sticking his nose where his nose doesn't belong. Monetary policy. Okay, kind of like almost Trump putting he's trying to put trying to influence Jerome Powell a little bit on these interest rates, right? Why the Fed failed during the Great Inflation. Early in his presidency, Richard Nixon appointed a close ally to head the Federal Reserve, Arthur Burns. Often pictured smoking the pipe, Burns was an economist at Columbia University who served as the economic advisor on his 1968 presidential campaign. Once Burns was installed at the Fed, Nixon had no reservations about using their relationship to his political advantage. Hence the idea Jerome Powell wants to be independent of political pressures for the Fed and monetary policy. With unemployment having risen during the 1970 recession, the president wanted a strong economy going into the 1972 election. So trying to control monetary policy and what we do to make himself look good for his re-election campaign coming in. Lead recordings from the Nixon White House, the so-called Nixon tapes that were very, very popular, provide smoking gun evidence that Nixon directly pressured Burns to stimulate the economy with looser monetary policy. And this is the big fear that I feel like we're having right now. Because if for some reason he's able to get Jerome Powell out of that chair and put who he wants, we don't know what that could do to our economy. And I can promise you this, if Jerome Powell somehow gets fired, which is not really possible according to law, or quits relatively soon and just drops it and just leaves and walks off, I think we're going to have a huge impact negatively in the economy and stock markets and everything, because that allows Trump to put in whoever he wants. And we didn't see much of that because Trump appointed Jerome Powell in his first term of office. And we didn't really see much pressure from him on Jerome Powell. He had the trust and the faith in Jerome Powell to do what he had to do for monetary policy for the greater good of the economy. But now he's like just off the rails, just saying whatever he wants, criticizing him, demanding he cuts rates, demanding he do this, so on, and so forth. The minute somebody else steps in place of him, and it's Donald Trump in his puppeteering ways, he could control basically monetary policy, and that could be a huge problem. That's why we want to have the Fed independent of political pressures, because look at what happened in the 1970s. Nixon did that to stimulate the economy with looser monetary policy, and it just created a havoc. We don't know why Burns ended up agreeing to demands, which I guess is sure. Burns really believed that Congress and the president should tackle inflation with more surgical price control rather than the Fed whacking it with the brute force of higher interest rates. The Nixon administration did, in fact, impose price controls at various times, including on gas, and that created all these different other things that happened as a result of it. Just absolutely crazy. It would take Jimmy Carter appointing Paul Volcker in 1979 to change the tack. The Fed had lost its credibility as an inflation fighter, and the challenge for the new chair was to restore it. Again, Jerome Powell always brings this idea of saying that he wants the Fed to have that credibility. He wants it to be that people in the U.S. can have the faith and the belief in the Fed to make the appropriate decisions and have credibility. And take a look at the federal funds rate from the last 10 years here compared to the 1970s. Look at the rate cuts. Rate hikes, rate cuts, rate hikes, rate cuts. Hike, cut, hike, cut, hike. Really big hike because we couldn't control inflation. Cuts. This is crazy. And if you're like, oh, how's that compared to today? Look at how much more simple this one is. Okay, we could raise rates, Okay, boom, COVID. Okay, go to zero. Stimulate the economy. Okay, well, inflation is now really high, obviously, as we know here. But taking a look at the federal funds rate here, it's night and day difference. Hike, cut. It just is wild to me. Imagine living through this. And this is where the Fed lost their credibility, was through this right here. This is where their credibility was lost because of this kind of idea, until Paul Volcker comes in, jacks rates up, which allows the recession to happen to cool off inflation. And then the one final thing that's really interesting here, and I listened to this interview with Jerome Powell when he went over here. In early July at a central banking conference, Powell was asked about Trump's continued attacks. I'm very focused on just doing my job. Again, he doesn't care what political pressures have to say about him. He doesn't care that there's a rumor that he's going to be resigning, that it's an encouragement for. He doesn't care that they're looking into the project over at the Fed about the renovations. He's just trying to do his job. Before adding that only matters important to him are fulfilling the Fed's congressionally mandated remnants of full employment and price stability. And this right here is what I thought was just this is where it should be. Central bank leaders in other countries and the European Union said they would have handled the pressure exactly the same as Jerome Powell. The European Union, the UK, Japan, Canada, so we're going to look at the Fed's independent decisions to help guide their own. So all these other Fed leaders in these other countries would have done the exact same thing. The exact same thing. So it's not like he's going rogue and doing whatever he wants. People in the same positions in different countries, other central bank leaders, will be doing it the exact same way that Powell's been doing it. And I think that says a lot about what he is, and again, why he's living for, making sure that our economy is able to have a soft landing. He's right now trying to figure out this soft landing mentality where we cannot go into a recessionary period. And so far, I will say he's done a pretty dang good job about it. But every single data point that comes in that backs up Jerome Powell's stance of not cutting rates, it just allows him to solidify his seat there for long. Because think about it. Jobs, he always talks about the labor market is strong, and a lot of the data comes in has shown the labor market is still relatively strong. The labor market is still relatively strong, which is why we don't need to cut rates, because we haven't had a collapse in the labor market yet. Keyword is yet. But for example, like I said before, if inflation data comes in this morning and tomorrow and, however many other data points, and it comes in higher than last month, that's going to be a data point that you don't need to cut rates, because maybe that inflation value, that inflation data, is coming from potential tariffs. We don't know, obviously, yet. We'll have to read into the data points more, but that's what we're looking at here. And so every data point that comes in, Jerome Powell is just sitting there saying, you can say whatever you want, dude. You can threaten to fire me. You can call me an idiot. But here's my data that backs up my stance. And so far, the data has been lining up with Powell and what's going on. So we'll see what happens with data points here in this point. Would it hurt to do one rate cut and see what happens in the economy? I don't know. I mean, I know I made a video about that earlier about maybe doing one rate cut and just seeing what happens. It's definitely not a bad way to look at things here. But, at the same time, I respect what he's doing. And, if inflation comes in higher than expected, I 100% back Jerome Powell what he's doing here. So thank you guys so much for watching today's video. Again, if you made this far in the video, feel free as always to like the video and subscribe to the channel as you already have done. Again, there's this rumor that he's going to be quitting amid the Trump tiff they have. I do not think Jerome Powell is going anywhere. And let me tell you, if I had a vote between Trump and Powell in charge of the monetary policy, I'm putting Powell in 100 out of 100 times here. So I hope you guys made money in the market in some way, shape, or form as per usual. And as always, I will see you guys in the next video.